All right, why don't we go ahead and begin? Welcome to the 2021 Leon Gordis Lectureship. Leon was the fifth chair of the Department of Epidemiology. He was the chair for at least 20 years and was the consummate teacher, well known for teaching Epi 1. And Moises Sklo and I have the great opportunity to now edit Gordis Epidemiology, and we're about to launch the 7th edition. Our speaker today is Linda Fried, MD, MPH. She's Dean and Dillamar Professor of Public Health at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. She is a geriatrician and an epidemiologist, internationally renowned public health scientist, clinician, and leader in medicine and public health. As Dean, Dr. Fried led the transformation of Columbia's MPH curriculum and has built many programs to address the critical issues of our century. And it's really remarkable the work she's done. I think all of us at Hopkins know her well for the vast output. She has over 500 scientific articles and chapters. She's led the research that defines frailty in aging as a new medical syndrome with distinct phenotypic presentations, etiology, and outcomes. She's led a whole raft of prospective cohort studies to define the causes and consequences of cardiovascular disease and disability in older adults. The cardiovascular health study, the women's health and aging studies, and the experience core that was developed here in Baltimore. The experience core is a community-based public health intervention to prevent frailty and cognitive and functional decline in older adults. And it's embedded in a volunteer program for older adults that builds social capital, serving in public elementary schools to improve the academic outcomes of children. Prior to becoming Dean at Columbia, Dr. Fried was director of the Division of Geriatric Medicine and Gerontology here at Hopkins, and she was the founding director of COA, the Center on Aging and Health. And she was a former faculty member in the Welch Center. It is our distinct privilege to welcome Linda as this year's Leon Gordis Professorship, and will be addressing us today. So thank you so much, Linda, for coming. It's nice to have you home.
David, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I actually brought my mug for my coffee for the occasion, you can see. But what I am really thrilled about is to be able to honor Dr. Gordis and to try and, at a perhaps 30,000 foot view, talk about a frame that I hope builds in his image on the implications of the longevity we have created through public health, for public health itself and for epidemiology. So I'm going to ask Laura to advance the slides, if you can do that, Laura. First of all, I just want to speak in honor of Leon, who really was such a beneficent human being. I learned that through his mentoring and very generous offer of guidance and sponsorship and mentorship. I also learned his impressive mind through his criticism. I learned what it meant, what an honor it was to have one's work critiqued with the opportunity to do better the next time and to grow. And I learned from him about the vision that's needed in leadership for recognizing the next stage that's needed, even if it goes against countercurrents, and building it when it's right. And certainly it was my honor to join the Welch Center, which was Leon and Paul Welton's vision, to join the Welch Center as one of its founding faculty at a time when the virtual bridge over Wolf Street was almost non-existent, and to try and build that bridge. So Leon is much missed and yet still very much alive. Next slide. I also want to, I realize that I'm out of date, David, since this is from the 4th edition, but I believe the quote stands. I want to honor Leon's definition of epidemiology as the basic science of disease prevention, and perhaps argue today that the evidence demands expanding and reshaping the right side of the sentence to go beyond disease to the next generation of what we need to create to live longer lives with health. Next slide. Leon, of course, was both a pediatrician and an epidemiologist, and his visionary work, from my point of view, sets the stage for what I'm going to talk about. He worked on childhood infectious diseases, rheumatic fever, sore throats, environmental factors like hazardous waste disposal that contributed to pediatric cancers. He laid foundational work on screening and primary prevention and drivers of adolescent health and the medical care systems we need to foster this, as well as the population-based public health. And to my mind, this work has set the stage for what I want to talk about now. Can I have the next slide? And that is that because of that work and much more, public health has created what we are now experiencing, which is longevity. Next slide. This is one way to describe what happened, of course. 100 years of investment to the present and projected into the future in terms of lowering of childhood mortality, immensely important, immensely successful, and immensely foundational to being able to have health futures beyond childhood. Next slide. And of course, we've gone through transitions and experienced dividends that this audience knows well. The first demographic dividend and the second demographic dividend are in large part products of those declines in infant and child mortality, as well as maternal mortality and lowering of fertility, and then our investments that have improved survival. Next slide. And because of that, we've seen this, what I would think of as a demographic revolution of certainly the 20th century, but it continues, we believe. Life expectancy up until the 1800s globally was life expectancy at birth was 24 years. It began to rise in the Industrial Revolution, and it's still rising in the main, although COVID and other factors are certainly jeopardizing it in the US. But this is a transformation of historic proportions and unprecedented, clearly, in human history. Next slide. And what we have done together is add 30 years to life expectancy at birth. In 1900, life expectancy overall in the US was 47 years. It's now 78.7 years and rising, at least for some subsets of the population. And 25 of the 30-year increase has been attributed to prevention, largely public health interventions, policy and regulatory measures, as well as improved education and poverty alleviation. This is built on Dr. Gordis's basic science of epidemiology for prevention and population health. And an astounding occurrence. Next slide. As a result, of course, and again, not surprising, people are living longer, more people are living longer, and an increasing proportion of the population is older. Currently, it's the proportion of the population that's 65 and older stands at about 15%, which is just the point, exactly the point when societies are called aging societies. Next slide. Now, this journey to longevity has been not limited to the US or the West or Japan, but is in fact global. Can I have the next slide? And it's happening at very varied paces. France, Sweden, and the UK on the left, particularly France and Sweden, took 100 years to become aging societies, going from 7% of the population who were 65 and older to 14%. For US is in the middle of that, but for other countries like South Korea and China and Thailand and Brazil, these transitions from a young society to an aging society are happening in a blink of an eye, practically in 20 to 40 years. And that rush of success leaves all countries, but particularly these that are transitioning so rapidly, unprepared for what it means to have longer lives and to actually make the investments that are needed so that longer lives are lived with health and well-being, and we reap the rewards of what we've created. Next slide. An astounding figure here is a global one. This is basically a year ago, when the proportion of young children under 5 and the proportion of people 65 and older converged in the world. And now the proportion of the old are increasing and the proportion of the young are declining. This year, the US also had a similar crossing, but the green line, which is almost analogous, is for those under 15. And the US has hit its own transition point where the proportion under 15 is equal to the proportion 65 and older. These are quite dramatic transitions. Next slide. So we actually have created a new stage of life. We've added 30 years to human life expectancy, a new stage of life. In general, this is a success, but the big question hanging over us is, what will our health status be in these longer lives? Because health status is going to be determinative of the opportunities of the longevity we've created and of what it means to societies to be aging societies. Next slide. So here are a set of scenarios about how people are thinking about this. These are, let's say in 1990, life expectancy was 78.8 years, and a proportion was lived disabled in the red, the vast majority, hopefully in the green, years of life free of disability, otherwise known as active life expectancy. What do we need to plan for and accomplish in the future? Well, there are a range of possible scenarios. May I have the next slide? One is that we will extend life expectancy. We will not shrink the numbers of years disabled, but the numbers of years disabled will be a smaller proportion of total life expectancy. A second scenario is what we call compression of morbidity, where we continue to extend life expectancy and shrink the number of years that people live in a disabled state. And the final one is where we extend life expectancy, but see a rise in the number of years lived with morbidity and disability. Obviously, looking at this, the choice is clear about what the optimal would be, that we create a health span in scenario 2 that approaches our longer life expectancy so that people are living these longer lives with health and function. Next slide. It's become very clear that what we do about this and whether we can make health span or healthy active life expectancy approximate our longer life expectancy is going to be the key in the lock for individuals and societies as to the opportunities of having added life years to life. Next slide. Now, clearly, health is a good in itself. And that's one reason to be investing. Clearly, healthy aging, if people are living with health rather than disease and disability, healthy aging would likely diminish the healthcare needs and costs that would result from the alternative scenario. In addition, we're learning that the benefits of health and function are that they unleash the ability of individuals, communities, and societies to experience the assets that people accumulate over their longer lives. And in fact, it's become very clear that older adults are the world's only increasing natural resource, with unrealized social capital as well as huge needs to give back in the later points of their lives. But we have not designed to enable these things to happen. Next slide. There's a lot of science now to describe the opportunities presented by more people with longer lives. Intrinsic assets that sound trivial, but actually are substantial. Wisdom, immense complex problem-solving abilities as people get older, and creativity. The assets of a lifetime of experience and expertise and perspectives that all of those bring. The time, perhaps, as people retire or shift priorities, to dedicate to how to actually enact the generativity, the desire to leave the world better than one found it, and a legacy before one dies, which is a key part of successful aging. And good health and function are critical to being able to use those assets, which are profoundly important and never before present at scale in human history. And we have a potential for new social capital at scale across our now longer lives, but we have not yet redesigned a society that essentially was designed when life expectancy was 47 for these added 30 years of life. Next slide. So the key in the lock, the challenge we have is, will people be living these longer lives, healthy or ill? Next slide. And I'd like to explore some dimensions of what we need to think about to be able to answer that question. One, of course, is to recognize the epidemiologic transition we have gone through. And of course, work after World War II, which was initiated by visionary epidemiologists, including Lou Culler, Carolyn Bedell Thomas, both well known to many people here, who recognized the rise of chronic diseases and began to try and understand whether they were preventable and malleable. What we've learned since that time through numerous population-based studies led by many of the people here in the audience today, we've learned a lot of things. We've learned, of course, that diseases are preventable, chronic diseases. I'm going to take a higher order view, if I can have the next slide, and say, oh, we can skip this. I'm sorry, go on. That what we've recognized is now in the US that 80% of deaths are due to chronic diseases, and that this is a huge problem to solve. Next slide. That this is not just in the West, that now all regions of the world here show chronic diseases as a premier cause of ill health. Low-income countries in the orange, lower middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, and high-income countries have now all experienced chronic diseases as dominant health issues. Next slide. And while in high-income countries in the bottom right, as a combination of prevention and better treatment, we are seeing a decline in deaths from many non-communicable diseases and a leveling out in upper middle income countries. In low and lower middle income countries, we're seeing stark rises in the numbers of what are called premature deaths from non-communicable diseases. So this is also a global phenomenon, both the demographic transition and the epidemiologic transition. Next slide. Now, the advantage of longer years of studying populations who develop chronic diseases has meant that we have been able to see, as people live longer lives, how causation and outcomes evolve. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Next slide. This is a 30,000-foot view of Linda's take, perhaps, on some of what we've learned. When I started out in the MPH program at, well, before it was the Bloomberg School, I joined Moises's chronic disease epidemiology program. And Moises, you, I'm sure, remember even much better than I do the day when you told me that the program was going to be transformed into a suite of disease-focused programs, cardiovascular disease, pulmonary disease, cancer, et cetera, that matched the organization of the National Institutes of Health, focused on end organ chronic diseases. I chose to become a cardiovascular epidemiologist. That's why heart disease and stroke are at the top of this chart. But what we've learned over the years, of course, is that there are shared risk factors across many chronic diseases, that environmental and factors and policy, social conditions and context are drivers both of those risk factors and of the context in which people are at risk of chronic diseases. And finally, we have also learned that there are biological pathways that are initiated by these risk factors and also independent and increasingly recognized as associated with aging itself, which also drive many chronic diseases at the same time. So we have had the, I guess, the good fortune to build on knowledge and take a high-level view of how to shape this into more effective prevention. Next slide. And we have learned, before we did that, a number of points, particularly as people live longer, to manifest the implications of what I just showed you. First, we've learned that end organ disease outcomes may not be independent, given their shared causality. Second, we have, next slide, please. We can see that in particular disease beds, of course. Here, this is from one study looking at cardiovascular diseases, vascular disease prevalence, and showing that it increases with age in parallel in all vascular territories up to age 95, and that 20 to 30% of octogenarians have vascular disease in at least one arterial territory, and generally multiple ones. So cardiovascular diseases are an example of co-occurrence and non-independence. Next slide. And the biggest take home, of course, is that not unexpectedly, given the both the shared causality across diseases and their independent mechanisms that are aging related, that multimorbidity becomes the norm as people have the opportunity to live longer. Next slide. Here you see one graphical display from the Women's Health and Aging Studies screenees. This was a population-based sample of women 65 and older in Baltimore City and part of Baltimore County. And what you see is the distribution of self-reported diseases, self-reported physician diagnosis of disease in these women 65 and older. And of course, you can see that the likelihood, the rates of multimorbidity, i.e. two or more diseases in the same person, are quite high. Next slide. And if you look at Medicare data, people 65 to 79, a third report two or more diseases. Age 80 and older, over two-thirds report two or more diseases. And 1/3 of Medicare beneficiaries have four or more. So people are living longer lives with disease and with more disease. Next slide. And multimorbidity itself starts to become a very big player. So much so that I think we're missing out if we don't recognize the import of prevention for a given disease in terms of how it impacts many diseases, like smoking, of course, which is a risk factor for 14 chronic diseases. What's the population attributable risk for smoking across those 14 diseases becomes a very important question and point. But there are lots of other dimensions of these diseases which have emerged as we've studied people with longer lives. One, of course, is that one disease which is seemingly independent of another can be a risk factor for another through other pathways. For example, osteoarthritis of the knees causing decreased mobility, decreased physical activity, and increased risk for cardiovascular diseases. And then, of course, we're confronted with competing risks for disease, which changes how we think about prevention in a lot of ways. Next slide. In fact, it raises questions like, if we can delay one disease for 10 years, how do we not make it a case of just leaving room for others to emerge? Do we need different prevention strategies in these longevity-informed contexts in order to optimize prevention and health? Next slide. The other thing we've learned as people have lived longer and we've been able to learn about health and study what happens is that diseases which have always been on the right side of the causal pathway start being on the left side because they become risk factors, not just for other diseases, but for the development of disability, of frailty, of falls, as well as, of course, mortality. And that also changes the game in terms of epidemiology, but it changes the game in terms of prevention goals. Next slide. Here's one little piece of evidence on the impact of disease on physical function and disability. This is a slide from some of our work in the cardiovascular health study, in which I looked at the proportion of the entire cohort of 6,000 men and women, 65 and older, and followed them both backwards and forwards in relation to an incident coronary heart disease episode, which is right in the middle between the vertical dotted lines. And we looked at their self-report of difficulty in different kinds of tasks before that event and after that event, and looked at that in terms of certainly whether they were alive, that's after the event, that's the top gold bar, but looked at it in terms of the energy demands of tasks. The bottom blue line is for high energy demanding tasks like climbing a flight of stairs or walking a half a mile. And you can see that the proportion without difficulty in this cohort before incident coronary heart disease was about a little under 60%. After the event, it dropped to less than 40%. You can also see that for less energy demanding tasks, walking on the level for a quarter mile in the medium and low groups walking across the room, that similarly there was a drop after the incident episode in the proportion without difficulty in these tasks. So different diseases have fingerprints on physical function, which are significant for each disease. And when people have different diseases, multiple diseases with different fingerprints, they act synergistically. Next slide. So one take on what we've learned, which is quite astounding, is not just that people are living longer lives and that we have transformed to a world of chronic disease. And I say that recognizing we're in the middle of a pandemic, and I'll come to that in a minute. But we also, I think, if I look back on the last century of public health, we've done something astounding, which is to demonstrate that health is malleable. And the malleability of health is, of course, our business in epidemiology as the basic science of prevention. The malleability of health sets the stage for great optimism. It sets the stage for being able to say that health is a human right, because we know that we can invest as societies in creating it. Next slide. And that malleability leads to recommendations like this one, priority actions for the NCD crisis from the 2011 Lancet Commission report, which looked at 5 major chronic diseases: heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes, and chronic respiratory disease, and identified the multifactorial strategy, the 5 priority interventions to lower shared risk factors for multiple diseases, so as to reduce NCD death rates by 2% per year globally, because these 5 risk factors cause more than, we now know, cause more than 2/3 of all cases of non-communicable diseases. This strategy, of course, recognizes the multi-risk factor import and the multi-outcome effects that I talked about before. Next slide. We've learned so much in the bottom right that a high percent of non-communicable diseases are preventable. We've learned what was an argument when I was in training, which is that prevention works at every age. When I was in training, the question among my betters was, would prevention work in older ages, and would it matter? Would doctors recommend it? Would patients do it? We now almost take for granted that the answer is yes on all those counts. And we've learned that there's a high societal return on investment, minimally 4x, for primary and secondary prevention. We also have learned that if we are able to invest in the malleability of health so that people arrive at older age, at age 70, healthy, they are positioned to stay healthy. And if they arrive at age 70 sick, they will get sicker. These learnings, I think, are transformative in terms of the opportunity to create health and its import. Next slide. And we're seeing payoff. Recent, what I would call US natural experiments are demonstrating that there is high potential for people to age with health, and at a population level for health span to now approximate life expectancy. I don't think we would have had the guts to say that 30 years ago. Here's one example from a report from Ken Langa in 2013, using data from the US Health and Retirement Survey study following this US cohort of people 55 and older from 2000 to 2012. And what Ken reported was a 25% decline in dementia incidence in this US representative cohort. This is astounding. But it turns out to be, if you look carefully, a subset issue, that this decline was seen in those who had benefited across their entire lives in the conditions that optimize health, higher education, and a life course of health promoting conditions. Next slide. So we're learning from the US's as well as other natural experiments that we can live long, that we can live long with health or without it, that health is modifiable, and that prevention works well into the oldest ages. And to say the obvious to this audience, that investments in healthy environments, in human capital, in healthy behaviors across the whole life course are effective, optimize the malleability of health, but we are also observing that it's the better resource segments of society who are enabled because of these investments to arrive at old age healthy and stay relatively healthy, and that those without cumulative advantages are accumulating ill health in middle age, whether it's in the US or globally, and are at much greater risk of disability and dependency by old age, as well as great multimorbidity. So with those learnings, what do we do? Well, first, I think it's important to say that how we invest as a society, of course, will matter. And you can see that on the next slide, which shows work from Vigard Skirbeck from 2012, comparing cognitive performance from ages 50 to 85 across nations and regions. Here, the measure of cognitive performance is immediate recall. And what Dr. Skirbeck was looking at, I think, is quite profoundly important, that the regions of the world that have been able to invest the most in the conditions that create health are demonstrating consistently at every age higher cognitive performance than those that have not been able to do so. And that at age 85, cognitive performance by this measure in the top group of countries is equivalent to or exceeds the top performance at age 50 or 55 in other countries which have been less able to make those investments. So how we use the basic science of epidemiology in terms of how we deliver the conditions that create health are having profound effects on how people living longer lives are aging, in this case, with or without optimal cognition. Next slide. So how do we roll all these dramatic transitions in demography and epidemiology, in health status and malleability, in the opportunity together to think about how to set the stage for aging and longevity with health? And one approach is to assess, as the last data I just showed did, or the last few, healthy life expectancy for our population. Next slide. Now, healthy life expectancy is formally defined as the expected number of remaining years of life spent in good health from a particular age, and usually it's from birth or age 65. Next slide. And here, looking from birth, you can see healthy life expectancy in the blue and years lived with disability for global data from 1990 to 2016, so over 26 years. Average life expectancy here is for an individual born in a given year, disaggregated into the expected number, as I said, of healthy years in blue and the number lived with disability or disease burden in pink. And what you see, which is optimistic, is an increasing healthy life expectancy in the blue over only 26 years globally. What you see in the pink is no decline and perhaps even an expansion of the years lived with disability. Next slide. The challenge here, one dimension of the challenge is if you look at the data by country and region. And here you see life expectancy in the length of the bars for different countries and regions. And you see in the light blue part of the bar, healthy life expectancy, and in the dark blue part of the bar, the proportion of total life expectancy associated with disability. And I think what you see is, of course, wide variation in life expectancy and years of healthy life expectancy across the world. Next slide. I'd like to put that into numbers. Between countries, there's a range of 38 years for life expectancy at birth. And across countries, there's a range of 37 years in the healthy life expectancy at birth for different countries. There, at 60 years, there's a gap of 13 years now in terms of life expectancy for those who survive to the age of 60. And the gap at 60 years is growing between high and low and middle income countries. And of course, we know that within a given population, the levels of health and the levels of capacity are distributed across the social gradient, and that the people with the greatest health needs consistently have the least access to the resources that might help. If we think of longevity and the health problems of older age, which are so deeply linked to chronic conditions and driven by disparities, it is critical to think about how to shape prevention to optimize equity in the opportunity for health across longer lives. Next slide. And in fact, the disparities are increasing. Next slide. Here you see some data on that from the World Health Organization's recent Decade of Healthy Aging report. And what you see is that the gap between life expectancy and healthy life expectancy at birth has increased from 2000 to 2019 globally. It's increased by over a year for both men and women in only that 19-year period. Next slide. And then we come to COVID, where of course we have seen so blatantly that those who are at the receiving end of health disparities, who manifest because of them high rates of prevalent chronic diseases, have been particularly at high risk for severe illness and death from COVID-19, coupled, of course, by the effects of age and aging, particularly with severe disease and disability. Next slide. Now, how do we improve the opportunity for health span with longer lives? Well, our first place to start is with what we already know. And here's Eileen Crimmins' prescription, which I think is well said for the US. We need a more focused effort to improve health, of course, increase life expectancy, which is now declining in subsets of the population and due to COVID broadly, and remove social differentials through improved behavior and social policy, leading to an increase in both life expectancy and health expectancy, and enacting the science that we all know. But do we need to do more? Do we need to look beyond what we know about disease to consider other approaches that will help us even more create health span that matches a longer life expectancy and perhaps even lengthen both? A number of years ago, Mary Tinetti and Terry Freed published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine. I think it ranks in my mind, as the most important ignored article of that year. But it was titled "The End of the Disease Era." I'm going to suggest that perhaps we just need to go beyond the disease era. Next slide. And a starting place, of course, is what we know about multi-risk factor lifestyle interventions. Here's data from a combination of the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study that was published a year ago in BMJ, looking at men and women in the US at age 50 and following them over the long term to look at healthy life expectancy as measured by whether or not they develop diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. And what you can see is that men and women who had none of the positive risk factors, in other words, never smoking, not being overweight or obese, higher physical activity, only maximally moderate alcohol use, and higher diet quality. Those who had none of those had a healthy life expectancy of 8 to 11 years lower than those who had 4 or 5 of those positive healthy lifestyles. And in fact, 90% of diabetes, 80% of coronary heart disease, 70% of CVD mortality, and 50% of cancer mortality were attributable to not following that low risk lifestyle. Now that's a disease focus, which is critically important and rolls up into this measure of how to create healthy life expectancy. Next slide. But of course, our frame is that the history of medical science and public health science since its origins in the late 1880s has been the study of disease. And we're learning, of course, that more than disease affects health. And so I'll just focus on a couple of dimensions of that because they offer opportunities for expanding the malleability of health and the optimization of health span. Of course, aging itself has been attributed as a causal factor in disease. whether that turns out to be merely, as some have asserted, a product of the length of time to experience the cumulative effects of development of disease remains to be nailed. But certainly there's increasing evidence that aging independent, for example, of the ApoE4 allele plays a role in dementia, and that the processes of aging themselves are ones that begin at conception and are forces for us to reckon with in addition to disease. Next slide. And we're learning, of course, that there are multiple layers of what creates health. A lot of it, what makes us definitively sick, is disease-based. But there are also aging-based processes we're only now learning about in terms of our intrinsic resilience and reserves and ability to bounce back from stressors, and our aggregate vitality, which perhaps can be a basis for thinking about what health really is as we seek to create a health span that equals our longer lifespan. Next slide. And we're learning in the middle category that with aging across the whole life course, that our physiologic systems, which maintain our intrinsic vitality, milieu, robustness, reserves, resilience, change over time. And in fact, there is, with aging, a dysregulation of many of those systems. And if too many of them get dysregulated, we actually lose homeostatic capacity, the ability to bounce back, to maintain equilibrium. And diseases appear to be superimposed on that, while they may also affect each other. Next slide. Dan Belsky and others have shown that these processes appear to emerge even in young adulthood. Right after Leon's studies of adolescence, here we'll look at the Dunedin study in 26 to 38-year-olds, where Dan asked the question of whether dysregulation of these physiologic systems might be a marker of premature aging and of poor health without disease. Next slide. And what he showed both cross-sectionally was that by these measures of looking at these physiologic markers, that you could say that people who are 38 and free of chronic disease varied in the integrity of their different organ systems, which he in some called biologic aging, but that the pace of change over the 12-year period from age 26 to age 38 really varied between people. And that over that 12-year period, there were some people who demonstrated no change in these intrinsic physiologic systems. And there are others that changed rapidly, what he would characterize as 3 years of physiologic change per chronological year. And that the greater pace of change, the degree of these, the change in these potential measures of biologic aging predicted aging-related outcomes, like decline in cognition, decline in strength and physical functioning, more self-reported difficulty in tasks, older retinal vessels, as well as just how old people looked. Next slide. Here's one example of a plot of the changes observed across different members of the Dunedin study and these different biomarkers of physiologic systems from ages 26 to 38. If he looked at the people, next slide, who were changing rapidly compared to not, those on the right, you see that actually that the greater pace of aging was associated with poorer grip strength in these 26 to 38-year-olds. And the greater biologic age at 38 was also associated with poorer grip strength, one measure associated with loss of muscle mass with aging and decline in function. Next slide. So over young adult life course, we're starting to see that there's this alteration in physiologic function. It varies with between individuals. Dan has gone on to show that it varies by economic status, and by early life adverse exposures, setting up trajectories of differences between different groups. We've looked over the years at what may well be the outcomes of that. And in terms of the frailty syndrome, where we see that a culmination of those declines in different systems associated with aging, perhaps propelled by disparities. Can I have a next slide? Passes a threshold of aggregate declines where we see the onset of what we now know is a new clinical syndrome, frailty. Next slide. And this emerges past this threshold amount of dysregulation, and actually emerges with a distinctive clinical phenotype that marks people who have the severe degree of physiological dysregulation, which is distinct from disease and diseases. Next slide. Here you see a figure expressing the syndrome as a whole, with the physical frailty phenotype marked by a constellation of symptoms and signs that emerge when the underlying physiologic and biologic changes reach a severity of threshold. I don't have time to go into this today, but what we have seen is that there are dynamic response systems which regulate our internal functions in the musculoskeletal system and the stress response system in the metabolic system, and that they work in combination, and it's the aggregate effects, which Ravi Varadhan so elegantly calls a physiotype of physiological dysfunction, which is not disease specific, which in fact leads to the consequences that become frailty. Next slide. So we have a clinical syndrome, if you will, of shrinking and slowing and weakness with low activity and low energy, which predicts poor outcomes and looks very much to be a vicious cycle of energy dysregulation associated with the outcomes of many alterations with aging at every level of biology and physiology. Next slide. The 5 markers are not a disparate list. Weight loss, weakness, low energy or exhaustion, slowed walking speed, and low activity actually we've shown constitute a vicious cycle that are deeply connected with each other and drive each other and are part of this problem of energy dysregulation with aging. Next slide. This has big consequences. Here you see our data from the cardiovascular health study showing that people who had 3, 4, or 5 of those criteria, who we thought were frail, only after 36 months or 3 years of follow-up in CHS, only 81% of those people were alive in the bottom line of this Kaplan-Meier survival curve, compared to those in the top line who were not frail at baseline, when 97% were alive at 3 years. And those with only 1 or 2 criteria, 93% were alive. Next slide. Now you see actually high rates of adverse outcome, a range of adverse outcomes associated with frailty, in addition to mortality, falls, worsening mobility, disability, and risk of hospitalization. We've shown many other adverse outcomes over the years, particularly slowed recovery from illnesses and surgery. Next slide. What's underlying those slowed recovery looks to be a very marked difference in the ability of older adults who are frail to bounce back from a stressor compared to those who are not frail or even pre-frail. So here you see an experiment that we conducted in the Women's Health and Aging Study in women 85 to 94 years of age. They fasted overnight and had a fasting blood sugar or glucose done on the bottom left at baseline, and then received a glucose tolerance test, drank a load of sugar, and we watched their body's response to that sugar load. This is a very common clinical test, low risk, done daily in many doctors' offices. But what you see here is that in these old women, 85 to 94, the frail group in the purple had a much more exaggerated increase in glucose on the left and insulin on the right in response to that glucose load compared to the pre-frail and non-frail groups, and a much delayed return to baseline. In fact, they hadn't gotten back to baseline. This has been seen in many other systems, exactly this a parallel set of observations, and indicates perhaps the physiologic dynamics that would explain why frail older patients have difficulty recovering from illness. Next slide. And in fact, this elegant figure created by Ravi Vardhan and Shenli Zhu shows how in healthy older adults on the left, who experience a stressor, they bounce back quickly, but with increasing frailty, the bowl of recovery gets wider and less deep, and bounce back takes much longer until with severe frailty, it becomes, the status becomes incompatible with bouncing back and actually incompatible with life. Next slide. So looking at this, I would add to Leon's definition that in addition to epidemiology offering a basic science on disease prevention, it also is offering a basic science on the biology of dynamical systems of our physiology and of aging. Next slide. And we are learning from this work, as well as a lot of other work, that studying the underlying aging processes may offer a new layer of public health insights, which we need to set our goals of creating a health span that equals our longer life expectancy. Next slide. So I'll end with a few thoughts. One is that the new geroscience, which Dan Belsky's work exemplifies, suggests that there are physiologic and biologic pathways that are associated with aging and may well be tempered by everything from medical therapeutics to physical activity. And these pathways actually are critical to the pace of the aging process, and that interventions that could be beneficial in slowing biological aging might actually also prevent chronic diseases and in the aggregate multimorbidity, declines in cognitive and physical function, and overall through these pathways improve health span. Very exciting. Next slide. So I think thinking about what we've learned from being able to study people across longer lives and watch the emergence of multimorbidity, the evidence on shared risk factors, studying the continuum of aging, reaping the benefits of investments in public health-led prevention, so that we are creating a century of longevity, I think now also opens up new views for public health and for epidemiology. Next slide. And I think it provides a lens which we need to hold ourselves accountable for in any part of public health that we're in. Asking the question, regardless of what we're doing, can we shape it so that people will be living longer lives healthy compared to ill? Next slide. This takes us back to the compression of morbidity, the public health goal for the world of increasing healthy later years through delaying the onset of morbidity and disability to the latest points in the lives of older adults and in the human lifespan. The thesis is that the same processes that cause the lengthening of our life expectancy, plus I would add others that we're just learning, could result in a reduction of morbidity or a delay in disability until just before death, and thus a compression of morbidity. Next slide. Are we seeing it? We are not yet seeing a compression of morbidity. We are not enacting adequately or fully what we have learned. Here are two studies from Eileen Crimmins and Vicki Friedman, both saying that overall the US has reduced mortality much more than it has succeeded in reducing morbidity. Next slide. And what we're seeing is a large gap between healthy life expectancy on the right and life expectancy on the left. And much need to close that so that people are not living 10 years of their later lives in ill health and disabled. Next slide. Now, the key to all of this is going to be resolving health disparities across the life course. This is, to my mind, the preeminent opportunity in the near term to compressing morbidity. Next slide. And then with that, we can turn towards the other dimensions of extending health span, which of course is an opportunity once we have lengthened life expectancy, which we have and we are. Next slide. And I think what we have learned is that no matter what part of the age spectrum we turn our attention to, that a critical question for public health and epidemiology for the future is to ask how we should be investing not just in improving someone's life now, preventing the near-term outcomes, but investing optimally in their health futures for their longer lives and for every stage of life. Next slide. Why do we do this? Well, because we wanted longer lives. We've invested for over 100 years in creating them. And because we now know that the assets of older age, which are tremendous, could be transformative for all of us to benefit from if there's adequate health. Next slide. This is a photo from the Experience Corps in Baltimore, one of our volunteers in a classroom, a volunteer, not a teacher. You can see in that photo the win-win of the assets of an older adult transforming all sets of lives. Next slide. So I'll conclude by saying that health and health span are essential to experience the benefits of an aging society, and because of a century of public health science, and particularly epidemiology as our basic science of prevention, that we know that health is malleable and we know the pathways to both accomplish it in the near term and how we might look to expand and evolve our vision to set our goals for a health span that matches life expectancy. Thank you.